Each year, there are over 2 million cases of self-harm reported annually in the United States, and that number may be much different for those of you who are in the UK. So if you happen to know the statistics, feel free to post them in the chat as well. But the number really primarily impacts our youth. And so to break the stigma of self-harm, Embark Behavioral Health is presenting this informational webinar in observance of Self-Harm Awareness Month. And so I am very honored to be the moderator for today's webinar on the topic of why I hurt myself, common misconceptions about self-harm. And it's facilitated by my amazing colleague, Gina Thompson. She's the executive director at New Haven, which is located in Springville, Utah, and is a long-term residential program for teens. So I'll do a more formal introduction, but I'm sure Gina is waving, so you can all see her. I know there's many of us in this room. So Gina is our expert today. She, again, is the executive director of New Haven, and her career, despite her beautiful youthful appearance, she started in 2006, so when she was like 16 years old, and she joined the team as a therapist, and she has worked for the next 7 years as both a therapist as well as the clinical director at New Haven, and it really has become Gina's second home. I have been able and been privileged to see her in action, and I can just tell and feel her love of working with the families, and they've just grown over the years. And she's had the privilege of returning to our organization in 2016, and she's provided clinical standards and training to New Haven, as well as its sister programs. And the opportunity to work only at New Haven presented itself in 2019, and Gina was really excited to return to the program as the executive director. So the majority of her career has been devoted to helping adolescent girls and their family to heal from the pain of the past and really to move confidently into the future. So again, she is super passionate about ensuring that families we work with get the really best quality care in the world, and that the healing changes that they're making really are lifelong, truly. So thank you so much, Gina, for putting this presentation together.
Well, thanks, Sabrina. It's morning. I'm in Utah. It's still morning here. So I'm going to say good morning and good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are. It's so fun to see people from all over the place jumping on here today and joining us. And like Sabrina said, time is valuable, and I really appreciate you taking some of your time to spend this hour together. I love that there's so many of us that are interested in this topic and want to learn more so that we can better help adolescents and young adults who are struggling with this. So when I started working at New Haven as a therapist in 2006, and I really wish, Sabrina was kind to say I started working when I was 16. I wish that was the case. But when I started in my professional career, one of the things that I wasn't totally prepared for was, okay, so what do I do when someone tells me that they're hurting themselves? I want to help, but I'm not really sure how to help, and I don't want to say the wrong thing, and I'm not sure what the right thing is. And I'm hoping that as we have this conversation today and talk with each other about self-harm, that some of you will be able to have some new ideas, and you'll leave with a better understanding of what self-harm is, what it means, what it doesn't mean, and what to do about it. So we've done that poll. We're just going to kind of talk first about the definition and scope, what we mean when we say self-harm or self-injury. So we today are going to be talking about non-suicidal self-injury. So that's the deliberate damaging of one's own body tissue in the absence of intent to die. So 1 in 4 teenage girls have intentionally injured themselves. 1 in 10 teenage boys have intentionally injured themselves. Rates of self-injury are between 38 and 53%, depending on where you look, for members of the LGBTQ+ community. The incidence of self-harm is highest in younger adolescents and then decreases as kids get a little bit older. And the practice of self-harm is so widespread now that researchers are starting to say we need to address this as a public health problem in addition to treating it on a case-by-case basis. And then you're going to hear me say this several times today, because this is one of the things that I didn't fully understand when I started in our field, is that self-harm is always a sign of distress and a signal for help. So we're going to talk about some common misconceptions. We know in the field of helping professions, all of us as helping professionals or people who, there were parents on here. A lot of us know that distress drives self-harm. And sometimes we have other questions, or there are misconceptions about what self-harm is or isn't. So we're going to talk about 3 really common misconceptions today. The first is that the only reason people self-injure is for attention. The second is that self-injury is a copycat behavior only and therefore doesn't need treatment. And the third is that everyone who self-harms wants to die. So the first misconception is people only self-harm for attention. And I want to talk about what the truth is about this misconception. Some people do self-harm for attention. That's true. It isn't everyone. Self-injury is communication, regardless of whether it's for attention or not. And people who self-harm for attention still need help. They're in deep pain. So I can remember probably within the first year of my career with teenagers in residential treatment, I was in a multidisciplinary treatment team meeting one day, and we were having this conversation about whether a particular client in our facility was self-harming because they wanted attention or were self-harming because they were actually depressed, is the language we were using in this meeting. And someone in the meeting said, "Does it really matter?" And that was the first time that I had kind of thought about that concept. Does it really matter? And this person went on to teach and train us in the moment and say, they're in pain either way, whether they're self-harming for attention or whether they're self-harming because they're, in our language, in our naive language, whether they were actually depressed. And the reality is that either way, this individual needed our help and our assistance. And it mattered less, it still mattered potentially to how we would approach and how we would intervene and those kinds of things. But the reality was that anyone who feels like harming themselves is going to solve a problem needs help. So we're going to do an activity here for a minute. I want you to imagine, some of you might have some lived experience with self-harm, and that's absolutely okay. If you don't have lived experience with self-harm, I want you to imagine what it would be like if you felt like hurting yourself was something that you were willing to do just so that someone would notice your pain. I want you to kind of imagine this idea of someone who's self-harming for attention, and think about what it would be like to be them and to be hurting yourself so that someone would notice that you were in pain. So we're going to do an empathy activity for a minute. And if you've got a piece of paper, write it down on a piece of paper, type it on your phone, or wherever you take notes in your life. I want you to talk from the first person or write from the first person You're going to go toward the feeling and toward the emotion. There's no judgment here and no fixing or solving anything. So I want you to write, if I'm you, and you is the person who is engaging in self-harm. If I'm you, I feel blank when I feel the need to self-harm. We're going to use first-person language very intentionally. If I'm you, I feel blank when I feel the need to self-harm. So take a couple of minutes and write that down. That feels heavy, doesn't it? There's such a vulnerability in engaging in this activity, and I really appreciate everyone being willing to do that and then willing to share those words in the chat. There's a heaviness when you listen to all of that, and sometimes as helpers or as parents or other people who are interested in this topic, it can feel like a little bit overwhelming to hear that deep pain. And not all of us have the lived experience of having self-harmed, but you all did a really great job of getting into your emotions and being able to have empathy for what somebody else might be experiencing. I really appreciate that. I think there's so much power in doing that activity and realizing what it might be like to be someone who is struggling in this way. Sometimes as a helper, we have times when we might feel a little less empathy. And this activity is something that can help us think and feel what it might be like. And then empathy is generated through that. The first person language, if you use this again for yourself or for someone else as you're trying to, teach or train or counsel or whatever, the first person language is incredibly important. So just keep that in mind. If I'm you, I feel blank. Thanks so much for participating in that. So the misconception of people only self-harm for attention. Sometimes that's true. Some people do self-harm for attention. Some people don't. And people who are self-harming for attention still need help. It's a sign of distress and deep pain, and we still want to go towards them and help. Okay, the second misconception we're going to talk about is that self-harm is a copycat behavior only and therefore doesn't need treatment. So I know from that first poll, as we were finding out what people's professions are, there are a lot of people who are working with adolescents in some arena. That's going to be outpatient therapy, it's going to be IOP, PHP, or RTC, hospital levels of care, it's going to be schools. And sometimes this misconception comes up with parents where they feel like, oh, my child isn't self-harming right now, but if they enter treatment and are in group with anyone who self-harms, then maybe my child's going to pick it up. So we hear things like, I don't want my child in treatment or in group with anyone who self-harms. My child's not done that before. And if they're in groups all day with other kids who do, I'm worried they're going to start self-harming. Now, as a parent who's got a child who's already struggling, the last thing we want to do is have them be in a situation that's going to cause them to struggle more. And that part's super understandable. And we want to be careful that we're not, that we're helping ourselves as therapists and mental health professionals and school counselors and all of us, as well as parents, understand that just being in a group with other folks who have self-harmed or are self-harming doesn't mean that somebody's going to automatically pick that behavior up. So here's the truths about this misconception. Sometimes kids do pick up other behaviors or new behaviors in treatment. That does happen. The reasoning behind that is kind of answered below here. Anyone who's in enough pain that self-injury seems like a reasonable solution needs the help that's provided in therapy. And when we get to the root of a child's struggles, the behaviors will start resolving on their own. So being in a group with someone who self-harms doesn't automatically mean that a child is going to start self-harming. Sometimes there are cases, and certainly there are incidences of self-harm being a copycat behavior. And we're kind of back to what we were saying on the last misconception, that anyone who's in enough pain that self-harm feels like a reasonable solution needs help. So, and then this last one, I just want to reiterate again that when we get to the root of what's going on for the adolescent, the young adult who's engaging in self-harm, the behaviors will start resolving on their own. The third misconception is that everyone who self-injures wants to die. This is definitely something that I worried about and wondered about a lot as a new therapist. And sometimes people who self-injure and people who want to die are in the same category, and sometimes they're not. Some people actually use self-harm as a prevention method against suicide. That maybe seems a little bit foreign. Why would somebody hurt themselves so that they don't kill themselves or attempt suicide? But it's true. Sometimes people are feeling like, I'm in so much pain, but if I self-harm, I'll be able to kind of focus on that pain, and some of the emotional pain will go away, and I won't be as likely to think about suicide for a period of time. The second truth about this is that some people are hoping that by self-injuring, others will notice their pain and help them to find help. So this is very similar to some of what we've been talking about. If I am someone who self-harms and I don't want to die, I might be hoping that self-harm is going to help someone see how much pain I'm in. And then the third truth that I've listed here is that even people who attempt suicide don't always want to die. So I put up a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge, and some of you might be familiar with why I would put that picture up here, because the Golden Gate Bridge has historically been a place where a lot of people die by suicide. And there have been people who have attempted suicide by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge who have survived. And those people have had and reported, and there's been studies done with those folks. Those people have reported that as they started that process of jumping off the bridge, some of their initial reaction was, oh my word, why am I doing this? I don't actually want to die. And so a lot of the folks who have survived, and anybody who's been to the Golden Gate Bridge or who's read about this, you know that that's not been most of them. Most of the people who have attempted suicide from jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge have completed suicide, and those who survived have really wanted to kind of get that message out there, that they had this moment of, this is not actually, I don't want to die, and I'm worried I'm going to. And a lot of them, this isn't the point of this conversation necessarily, but a lot of them have used that as sort of a jumping off point of how they kind of turned their life around because of the experience that they had. And certainly we know that to be the case with people who are attempting suicide and surviving that attempt through other methods. So this thought, when I was a young therapist, of everyone who self-injures wants to die was really scary to me. I felt like, oh my word, if a client tells me that they have cut themselves, for example, then it means that they're trying to die. And we need absolutely to be aware of that and to be careful of that and to assess for safety. And everyone who self-injures doesn't want to die. As we think about all the misconceptions, and I told you I was going to say this a lot, I'm going to say it again. Self-harm is a sign of distress. It's a signal that help is needed. So how do we help? What do we do about this? If we are working with somebody who self-harms, if we love someone who self-harms, if we're trying to understand this better, what do we do? So we're going to talk for the next several minutes about two main aspects of helping those who self-injure. We're going to be focused on providing a safe place for sharing the emotions that are often associated with self-injury. And then the second thing is we're going to talk about incorporating the adolescent's family into the healing process. So sharing emotion changes emotion. When someone is engaged in self-harm, it's typically an isolating experience, typically viewed as something that is different or not okay. And we want someone coming to therapy to have a connecting, safe, shame-reducing experience where they feel heard. So one of the things, there was a study done, a meta-analysis, and some of you might be aware of this. If you're a fan of Scott Miller at all, a lot of his work points to this particular study. So this meta-analysis was done in 1999 of 6,000 studies about what makes therapy work. And this is what was found out of that meta-analysis of 6,000 studies, is that the biggest thing that has an impact on someone's perception that therapy helped them was variables outside of therapy. So this is maybe somebody who comes to therapy because they're depressed and they don't have a job, and that not having a job is part of the reason that they're depressed. And then they get a job, and some of that depression, or all of it maybe, lifts. So we could say, and we'd probably like to say as people in the helping profession, well, we did some things in therapy that helped them have confidence, so they showed up better in their job interview. But that kind of stuff is a little bit harder to track. So those extra therapeutic variables, that's 40% of what helps someone improve and get better. The cool thing is that the next largest segment is the therapeutic relationship. So that's 30% of what people attribute getting better to, is the relationship they had with their therapist. That's more important than what method we used. It's more important than the technique. It's more important than how long we've been in this field. The therapeutic relationship, and this is not what the study said, but I'm going to expand it to the connecting relationships. Whether you're a therapist or not on this call, the connecting relationship is really where so much of the magic happens. So if I'm an adolescent who comes to therapy because I'm self-harming, I maybe don't want to be there. Some teenagers are coming to therapy of their own accord, and a lot are coming because their parents or someone else in their life has said, hey, this thing is a problem and we need to go get some help. So I might feel like there's something wrong with me. I might feel like I feel bigger emotions than most people. The emotions I feel I've been told are not okay. I'm doing this behavior, this thing, and I'm cutting myself, and so now I'm in trouble and I have to go get help. And so when they come into a therapy setting, or they come into the school counseling office, or wherever you are that you're working, one of the most helpful things we can do is hold space for them to be able to share whatever emotion they need to, and to have us be non-judgmental about it. So if I am an adolescent and I'm going to therapy and I go into the therapy session and I say, I'm depressed all the time. And I'm so sad. And I've started cutting myself because I feel that bad. And the therapist says back to us, but you're on the honor roll and you have a really great family. And I had your older brother in therapy a couple of years ago, and you're not nearly as bad as him. And those kinds of things that we mean, we're trying to be well-meaning and we want the person to feel better. And the reality is that that's not always going to work. And what is more often going to be helpful is to say, I'm so sorry that you feel so bad so often. That must feel heavy. It must be hard. I bet that there are days that you don't want to get out of bed. I'm so thankful that you came here. Lots of people have big emotions. I'm going to be able to help you figure some of those things out. I'm going to be here. I'm going to listen. You can talk about whatever you need to in therapy, those kinds of responses, so that we're allowing space for sharing of emotion. Our world is getting a little better at this, and we've got a long way to go. Most people feel like there are ways that we should feel and ways that we shouldn't feel. And it'll be so cool when we get to the point that our world doesn't categorize emotions as good or bad, but just categorizes them as vibrations in our body that are things we feel, and that all of them are okay. So that's the experience that we want someone to have in therapy. That's really the experience we want them to have in therapy, no matter the presenting problem or what the content or the symptoms are. But certainly in this case where self-harm can be so isolating, and a lot of times someone who is self-harming might have received the message that the emotions they feel are not okay, or they're too big, or kind of that this person shouldn't feel the way they feel. It's okay to feel however we feel, and providing that for an adolescent is a major thing. So that's the first part. And then the second part is that family health optimizes individual health. We will do better to have the whole family involved in therapy, so that true healing can take place, that healing can be long lasting. These are questions that you can ask in family therapy. These are ways to draw out kind of what those family dynamics might be, and involving the whole family in an adolescence treatment is not only going to help the kiddo feel like, gosh, we're all doing this together. It's also going to resolve and shift patterns that are contributing to what's going on for that kiddo. So we want to look at how emotions are being handled in the family. So for example, what if one night at dinner, a parent said, I had a really hard day at work today. and I was in a meeting and I got some feedback that was hard for me to hear, and I felt overwhelmed and I wanted to come home. So instead of coming home, I went for a walk for 10 minutes and I listened to my favorite podcast, or I listened to some music, and I felt better. And then I went back to my desk and I was able to do the rest of my day. What if we had that kind of conversation at family dinner where a parent said, I had a hard thing, I felt a big emotion, and this is how I handled it. If a family's not doing that already, we can teach them. We can help them learn how to have emotional safety in their family and to have emotional conversations. We also want to look at family roles and relationships. So sometimes kids who are presenting for treatment are identified in the family a certain way. Sometimes they're the black sheep in the family or the identified patient. Sometimes they're the golden child, and the pressure of that has gotten to be too much and they can't do it anymore. And so they've started to have some symptoms show up. We want to look at those things. We want to look at what the relationships are like. Is everybody on good terms with one another? And by good terms, I don't mean everybody has to be perfect all the time. I mean, do people feel like they've got a connection? Do they feel like there's a strong relationship there? How does each person in the family describe what those relationships are? We can figure out how the family communicates. Are they people who talk when there's something hard going on? Is there a lot of yelling in the home? Is there a right way to behave and a wrong way to behave? And then if there is, how does the family communicate about that? Is there silent treatment if you're not doing the quote unquote right thing? So we want to look into how the family communicates and then start working on any things that could be improved. And then we also want to talk about how rules are handled in a family. So one of the things that we get tempted to do as parents, and I'm as guilty of this as the next person, is that when something is seeming problematic, we think of consequences, or we think of how we might need to change something so that this thing doesn't happen anymore. And one of the things that happens often when teenagers start having trouble with rules in a family is that technology is taken away. And I'm not making a blanket statement about technology, that kids should or shouldn't have it. There are lots of, that's a whole different conversation. However, how that rule is handled can really go a long way. So sometimes adolescents who are self-harming get involved with social media that is glorifying self-harm. There are literally millions of posts on social media about self-harm in a way of people showing each other what they've done or telling each other how to self-harm. So maybe a family decides that that's a big problem for their teenager and that they need to remove that opportunity for a little while. How they talk about that and how they do that can make a world of difference. So saying something like, it seems like Instagram and Snapchat have been really hard for you lately. And I think that we need to take those off your phone to help you be safe. So can we talk about that a little bit? That would be the preferred method, or something like that. We're saying, we're talking about safety, we're concerned for you. Can we talk through this? Sometimes in the heat of the moment, as parents, we're more likely to say, I'm taking away your phone right now. I can't believe you keep looking at all those pictures of kids cutting themselves. Seriously, you can't have this, because we're reactionary and we're overwhelmed and we're scared for our kids. So we need rules, we need boundaries, and how we communicate about those can really help the outcome. So family health optimizes individual health.
Gina, what do you mean by family health?
Oh, great. Yeah, so family health, what I mean there is how a family works together, how a family communicates, how they share, how they spend time together. So it is a broad, it's intentionally broad. There's no one right definition of this is how the quote unquote healthy family operates. But when a family gets involved with their adolescent child who's in therapy, when they get involved in therapy and they look at, hey, as a parent to this child who's struggling, what do I need to do differently? How could I adjust? How could I change the way I'm interacting with my child or with my family to help? That's what we're looking for here, is the family getting engaged so that it's the opportunity to heal is for the whole family. And the more the family is engaged, the better the outcomes for the adolescent or young adult. I think we heard the word power used a couple of times, and that's one of the things that is so valuable when we're talking about anything we're struggling with. When we verbalize it, and some of the power just goes away just by verbalizing, just by saying this is what's going on, because in our heads so often we've turned it into a big problem, and it still might be a big problem. It still might need a solution, but we've made assumptions in our mind about what people are going to think about us and what it means about us. So verbalizing takes away the power. And then I think that word was also used when it came to the family stuff. Like there's power in the whole family being involved and being able to work together for solutions. If there are one or two questions that anybody wants to post in the chat, Sabrina could call one or two questions out that we could answer in the next 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll get wrapped up.
Yeah, we'll do rapid fire. I did have a couple at the beginning of the session, and it was more just on the therapeutic rapport. So they were questions around like, how do you help to provide support to a client that perhaps you don't know very well, or you haven't developed that alliance yet, and trying to ask them if they have thoughts of self-harm. How do you get there?
Yeah. So I think that one of my favorite things to do when I have a new client is to spend the first few minutes of the first session saying, tell me stuff that's not therapy related. So sometimes in a first session, this is going to be an adolescent and their parents. Sometimes it's just going to be an individual, but saying, tell me all the cool things. And sometimes I'll ask the parents. If I do this, I usually give the parents a heads up beforehand. I'm going to ask you to brag on your kid for a minute so that they're ready, because their mindset might be stress and nervousness about a therapist and, those kinds of things. So I'll give parents a heads up and say, I want you to brag on your kid for a minute. Or I'll say, tell me all your favorites. Like, what was your favorite family vacation? Or what's your favorite treat? What's your favorite thing to do when you don't have anything to do? And just try to get to know them as a human, so that we're connecting as humans, walking this path of life together, as opposed to, hey, I'm the expert and I'm going to fix you while you sit here in my office. And sometimes just that act of like, let's just be humans together can really help people start to feel more comfortable. And then I do set some ground rules before the end of the first session of kind of what to expect in therapy. So here's the things: if you tell me X, Y, and Z, there's the potential that I may need to report it. Everything else is going to be kept confidential. And then I like to use humor a lot. So I'll say something to an adolescent like, all right, so let's just get real with me. What's the chance that you're going to tell me if you're feeling like you want to hurt yourself or you want to die? And kids are most often honest about that. We want other people to know about us. We want to be known and understood. And so more often, kids are going to respond. And then I'll say, if we need to, I'm going to ask you at the end of every therapy session, like how you're doing. And when I say end, give yourself time so that you're not going into the next hour. But I'm going to ask you each week about safety. So that's something that that you can expect from me. And it just really normalizes it. Like, yeah, we've got to talk about safety because that's one of the reasons you're here.
I'm seeing some stuff in the chat too. What it can be really hard sometimes to be so upfront and direct about these conversations. And I remember in social work school feeling the same way, like, oh, you can just say it. But being so direct and putting it out there makes a huge difference. And thank you, Gina, for really making that the forefront of this conversation, that it's okay to do that. And it's,
yeah.
Like research shows that that's the best approach. So I know we're already 2 minutes over time. If you are okay with it, all right. So I am seeing a lot about assessment tools. If
Great.
you have to pick one more question, if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So one really great assessment tool is called the PHQ-9. It's internationally validated, and I have used it for years. The PHQ-9 pediatricians have started using it now too. It's an assessment for depression, but it asks questions about self-harm and thoughts of wanting to die. I also like it because it's easy. The PHQ-9, and any score above a 9 means the score is clinically significant. So it's easy to remember and you don't have to have a whole lot of training. The questions are incredibly straightforward. You can have it, there are paper versions of it, and you can also have it done electronically. And there's a lot of research behind that specific instrument because it's asking about self-harm and thoughts of wanting to die. For anybody who's looking for like a comprehensive suicide assessment, realizing that's not what we talked about today, the Columbia Suicide Protocol is a great one.
And again, really appreciate your attendance and engagement and participation today. It has been just such an honor. So thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.